All right, good morning, everyone. This is Terry and Carla from the Des Moines User Group, and we are going to talk about flows today. This is kind of an introductory course that we are going to do, and just a couple things to be aware of as we get started. We have muted everyone, so if you try to speak, we will not hear you. I would ask that you instead post questions as you have them in the chat window. Carla's going to be watching that primarily and responding to your questions as we go through the session. And then a reminder that we are recording this session. It will be available online publicly, so try to be on your best behavior so we look reasonably good to the rest of the world coming here from Des Moines. And then also we do need, because this is an official Salesforce user group meeting, we do need to take attendance. So if you are logged in and your name is not clearly identified in the participant list, do you mind just quickly typing your name in the chat window? And if you're in a room with multiple people, add everybody's name into that chat window, and that'll help Carla get an accurate attendance for us for our meeting. And so with that, just a reminder, we are doing 6 of these sessions throughout the year. This is a replacement to what we used to call Trailhead Tuesdays. And I'll be leading this first one today. And our use case is going to be to add a lead to a campaign. Abby Douglas and Clarissa will be taking the next session on April 14th. And we'll be looking at doing some roll-up summaries. And then on June 16th, Michelle Hansen, she's the user group leader over in Cedar Rapids. She's going to take that 3rd session, and then we're just going to kind of repeat and go through the rest of the sessions. If you miss a session, I wouldn't worry too much. You can watch the recording, but the basics that we're going to cover today, we're going to cover those in the next 3 sessions as well. So I think you'll be able to kind of follow along as we go. And hopefully by the time we get down to that end session, you'll be pretty decent at creating some of these as well. So our first session, what we're going to cover is like I mentioned, the basics of the flow builder, the concepts, and some best practices. And then specifically in this session, we'll look at actually building variables, getting records, creating records, making some decisions within our flow, how to send an email through the flow. And then of course, we do need to activate a flow as well, similar to what you're used to with Process Builder. And this particular flow, we are going to kick off using Process Builder. And then we'll also talk through how do we go about testing our flows. So our use case is this. We want to automatically add a lead to the Going with the Flow newsletter campaign when the lead source is a Flow webinar and they have an email address. We then want to email that user or that lead to confirm that they want to opt into the newsletter. So these use cases, they're basic use cases that we're going to use. They're not intended to necessarily be something that you implement. There's a lot of gaps in some of what we're doing, mostly because we're trying to do this in a way that is easy for you to learn how to use flows, not necessarily be a perfect flow. So keep that in mind as we go through this. And I'll mention a few things that I would probably do different even as we go through this particular exercise. So that's all I've got there on our slides. So I'm going to get that out of the way, and we're going to jump right in to the actual flow builder. So the first thing I want to do is we're going to take a tour, and I'm going to use Salesforce's own help files as we go through this first section of our session today. The reason for that is it's really pretty good. I really think Salesforce did a nice job of putting together information that helps us learn how to use flows. So I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to leverage what they've already put together. So the links for all these pages we will have online as well for you. So don't worry about trying to copy anything down. We will share the information with you. But when you first create a flow, you're going to come in and you're going to get a kind of a blank screen. So let's kind of talk through the elements on that screen. The first thing that you'll see across the top here is your buttons that allow you to run your flow, debug a flow. It allows you to save it, and then also manage your activate and deactivate features of your flow. The nice thing with the run and the debug is that allows us to actually kind of do some testing of our flow before we actually activate it. And the difference between these two, I'll show you here in a little bit after we get ours built. We're going to debug our flow, but the main thing is with the debug, it's going to display a new panel on our screen that walks us through all of the variables and the steps that we went through to create the flow. So it really is designed to help us troubleshoot, where the run just does what it says. It's just going to run that flow. In the middle of our flow page is what we call the canvas, and that's where you're actually dragging elements on and building the path that you want your flow to take. And then on the left-hand side, you have your toolbox, and there's two sections of your toolbox. You have your elements, which are the items that you see dragged onto the page. And then the manager, I like really well because that shows me all of the resources that I've created. And we'll talk a little bit here about what is a resource and how that works. So that's your canvas. And our flow concepts are the next pieces that we're going to talk through. So we're going to hit all of these items, and let's just dive right into the very first one, the building blocks of our flow. So when we're going to create our flow, we're going to use combination of elements, connectors, and resources to build our flow. An element is the items that you see in the colors down here in the picture. Your connectors are the arrows that define when I go from one element to another. That's the connector. And then resources are actually embedded inside of those elements. And that's what you see here in this larger screen, a variety of different resources that are created. Now, don't get too concerned. We're going to walk through this in detail. So if you're feeling a little bit lost already, don't worry. Hang with me and we'll actually talk through these in greater detail. There are multiple types of flows that you can create, and they are listed here. We're going to focus mostly on screen flows and auto launch flows with no flow trigger. But there are a variety of other types of flows that you can initiate. So just be aware of that. The primary difference between an auto launch and a screen flow is just as its name indicates, a screen flow, there's a screen involved. It provides the user that ability to enter information into the screen, where an auto launch, think of an auto launch maybe a little bit more like a process builder, and that you don't have the ability to ask for any additional information from the user. It just does what it's told. So that is the primary difference between these two. All right, over to flow elements. Remember, the flow elements are the little colored blocks that we're dragging onto the page. And we're going to, in this particular session, we're going to talk about creating records. We're going to use the get records. We're going to use a decision, and we're going to use an email alert. These other flow elements we'll talk about in some of the future presentations. And so you'll get familiar with how to use. I don't know if we're going to use all of them, but we'll get a pretty good chunk of these into the training. And then our resources, to me, resources might be the harder one to understand. And the way I kind of look at a flow, you might be able to kind of equate it to like building a house. So before you build a house, you have a blueprint, And inside that blueprint, you might have different rooms in your house. So maybe the flow is that blueprint, and your elements that you're dragging into that are say the rooms. So you have a living room that we want to put in the house. We have bedrooms, we have bathrooms that we're dragging into the house. But and that might be what you'd consider to be a element. A resource gets to a lot more granular detail. So inside that room, it's painted a certain color. So color might be considered a resource, and I can set that resource to whatever color I choose that I want to paint the room. So that hopefully maybe that kind of analogy might help help you understand the difference between the element and a resource. You know, an element might be a light switch, or it might be the type of flooring that we're putting into the room. But it's always tied back to the fact that it's a part of that room itself, or the element that it's associated with. Now, taking that into more of a flow concept, we have different types of resources that we can use, like a choice. Choice would be the equivalent of what you're used to as a pick list. You have a constant. A constant is just a resource that doesn't change. So it's always going to have a certain set value. We'll have decision outcomes, and we're going to use those today. You've got formulas. Formulas work just like you're used to with Salesforce formulas, and a variety of others. So including your pick lists, choices, screen components, text templates, and we're going to use a text template today as well, and then a variety of different variable types that we can create as well. So moving quickly over here to our best practices. Always plan out your flow before you start building. So if we were building a house, you wouldn't just go out and buy a bunch of material and hope that it all works together to create a home for you. You're going to first begin to design, what do you want that house to look like? And you need to think about that as well when you're building out your flows. So start with a plan. Always, it's recommended that you build and test your flows in a sandbox environment. I know that sometimes it's easy to cheat and do that in production, but best practice would be to do that in a sandbox. We never hard code IDs, and I'll show you how we're going to get around that in our example today. Wait until the end of the flow to make changes to your data, to the database. So here what they're talking about is when you're writing or creating or updating records, you want to make sure you're doing those in a bundle. So let's say I'm on a contact record and I want to update all of my, I'm on an account record and I want to update all of my contacts. So I might have one contact, I might have 5, depending on the account that I'm looking at. And when I'm going through and looking at each of those contact records, I don't want to look at one contact and then save it, look at a second contact and then save it, look at the third, and so forth. I want to look through all of those records, save whatever change I need to make to it, to what we call a collection, an S-object collection. That's just another resource or that we're creating. We're going to talk through those, but I want to store all that, and once I'm done looking through all of my contacts to make the change, I want to save it at the end of the process. And that's what they're referring to here. Wait to the end of the flow to make your changes. That keeps you out of governor limit challenges, and that's typically what I see as one of the bigger challenges with flow is it's really easy to get yourself into trouble with governor limits. So that's a really good best practice to kind of watch for. Control when running users can navigate backwards. So when you're working with a screen flow, which we're not doing today, but when you're working with a screen flow, you've got, it operates like a wizard does. So you've got the ability to move forward and backwards. Well, you can control that forward and backward movement. And that's what they're referring to here. Again, it kind of comes back to having just a good design as to what it is that you're trying to accomplish in your flow. Always provide an error handler, and we'll talk about how we'll do that. Save early and often. This one caught me just about a month or so ago, and I literally lost an entire afternoon. I was working on a really large flow, and I forgot to save it partway through. And what had happened is my Salesforce session expired, and I didn't realize it until I went to hit save, and all of a sudden I couldn't save my flow. When you're in a flow all day long, it is not, Salesforce isn't going to prompt you and say, hey, you might want to sign in, or you might want to save this. It just logs you out behind the scenes, and if you don't save it, you'll end up losing some time like I did. Test with as many permutations as within your flow as possible. That just means we're going to test every possible branch that flow goes down. Avoid any access to external objects and after a DML operation. So if you're in an org where you're using external objects, which may not be very many of us, but if you are, that's what this one is referring to. What they recommend is that you simply break up the update element with a screen before you begin to access an external object. So that one is probably not near as common, but the rest of these I think are really good best practices to follow. And that takes us through that first section. So we're going to jump into actually creating our flow, and let me get a few things out of the way so I can walk us through this. So in our use case, we have a lead record, and we're going to use Miss Boxer here. And Miss Boxer has a lead source here of Flow Webinar, and she is a part of this campaign called Go with the Flow newsletter. Okay, so that is our end result. We want, whenever a lead source is set to Flow Webinar, we want to have them automatically associated with this campaign. And so to do that, we're going to go into setup. We're going to type flow into our quick find, and you'll find your section here for flow. And we're simply going to click the new button. First thing it's going to ask us is what type of flow do we want to create? Remember that the two that we're primarily focused on are the auto launch flow and a screen flow. These others that you see here are templates that have been added to this particular org. You may or may not see this sort of thing in your org, but you will see at a minimum these two. And in this case, we're going to do an auto launch flow, and I'm going to go ahead and hit create. And this is where flow gets a little bit intimidating, because it comes in here and you're at this blank screen and you don't know what to do. And so our first thing that as we look at the process that we're trying to accomplish here, we're going to begin to drag these elements from our toolbox over onto the panel. So the first thing that I know that I need to do here is I need to know what lead record I'm working with, and what is that campaign that I need to tie them to. So I'm going to start off in my manager over here, and I'm going to create a couple of resources. And the first resource I'm going to create is going to be of a type called a variable. A variable is just going to be a placeholder to hold some value that we're going to store in it. And I'm going to give this a name of variable var, and I'm going to call it lead ID. And my type that I'm going to use, so the type of data that this variable is going to hold, is just simply a text. And I've got the ability with a variable to allow that to have multiple values in it. If it's got multiple values, then we call that a collection. In this case, we just need to capture one value. Down here below, I've got the ability to make this variable visible outside of my flow. And so I do need that to happen because I'm going to push a value from Process Builder into this particular flow. And to do that, I have to make it visible outside of the actual flow itself. So we're going to check that box, and you're going to see as we get over to Process Builder how that works. So I've created that resource, and you'll see that listed over here now in my side panel. The other one that I need to do is another variable to hold the campaign ID. So I'm going to call that var campaign. Actually, I'm going to go with campaign name. And that's also going to be just simple text. And we'll make that available for input. Again, it's not going to be a collection in this case. Okay, so I've got two resources available. I'm going to jump back over to elements, and now I want to go out. I know the name of my campaign. I need to get the ID of that campaign. So I'm going to do a get records. I'm going to drag that up here onto my screen, and I'm going to simply call it get campaign. And because I'm doing a get record, this element is going to ask me what object do I want to query against. And I'm going to just simply start typing in campaign, and it'll show up in my list. So I'll select that. Gets a little bit more complicated now because now I've got my query information here. So what campaign record do I want to retrieve? And I'm going to retrieve the campaign name where it equals what I passed into the flow. So I'm just going to type in name. You'll notice that what you see here is a list of all of the fields on the campaign. So the flow is smart enough to give you some guidance, and you can simply scroll through that to find it. Find your field. I'm just going to type it because I think it's a little bit faster and easier. So I need the name to be equal to the campaign name that I'm going to pass into the flow. Again, I'm doing this because I don't want to hard code that campaign. This also will give me the flexibility to use this flow for other campaigns. It doesn't have to be just the one campaign. I can use it for any campaign that I choose. Okay, so I've got my campaign object, and I'm querying where campaign name equals the value that I'm passing in. If I scroll down a little bit further, this portion of a get record has changed recently. And these buttons down here allow us to control how we want this get to behave. So we can get either the first record or we can get all records. Hopefully, I'm going to pass in a name that's unique. And so I'm expecting just one record. If I choose all records, then I'm going to have a collection. One record is just a single record. The three options here for how I want to store the data. In this particular example, I'm just going to let Salesforce take care of it for me. That kind of hard for me to do because I like to control how the values are brought back into the flow. And so later in our flow, we're going to do another get, and I'm going to actually choose one of the other options so that you can see some of the differences in how those specific elements work. So I'm going to go ahead and click done. So we have everything defined there. And then I'm going to create my connector. So by hovering over the little circle, I can get a line to draw between my start and my get record. Now, it's a good idea when you're getting records or writing that, or let's just stick with getting records. you want to make sure that you actually found your record. So I'm going to use a decision element in here. And I'm going to call this thing decision found campaign. And I've got the ability now to create two different outcome options or multiple outcome options here. I'm going to create two. This first one, I'm going to give it the label of no campaign. And for this particular value to evaluate to true, what I need to do is look at that record that I just pulled from the get campaign, that's this right here. And I need to check to see, is that null? Is null true? So if I didn't get any results from my get, this is going to equate to true, and it's going to let me know that I'm going to go down a path here called no campaign. If I did find data, which is what I'm hoping for, I'm going to go down the default path, and I'm going to call that found campaign. So that might be just a little bit confusing. So let's just play it out here a little bit, and we're going to come back to how this decision works here in just a minute. So hang tight with me. I'm going to make the assumption that I found the campaign, and if I find the campaign, that means I've got the ID, and so with the campaign ID and the lead ID, I can go ahead and create my campaign member record. So I want to create a record. That's going to be my next element. And I'm going to call that create underscore campaign member. How many records do I want to create? Well, I'm going to only create one, and I'm going to use separate resources to determine what fields I want to write to in the campaign. I could use all. If I did all, I would have had to define a campaign member record and defined what values would go into each of the fields. In this case, to keep it simpler, I'm just going to use the separate resources because that lets me define it all within this particular element. So the object here that we're writing to is campaign member. And what you'll see is that I've got the ability now to choose the fields on that campaign member that I want to associate values to. So my campaign ID, I need to write a value to that. And I'm going to be able to get that from that get campaign object that we created. So get campaign, you'll notice that it puts a little dot right after that name. And what you're seeing up here above is all of the fields from that campaign record that we got. And so what I'm looking for is the campaign ID, which is here. I'm going to add another field because in order to create a campaign member, I have to also have a lead. So we're going to click back on the field, select lead, and I should have my lead variable that we passed in that I can associate to that particular value. So that's going to create now my campaign member. Those are the only two values that I need to successfully create a record. On a campaign member, there is that, I think they call it a status field, but that defaults to sent, and I'm okay with that in this particular case. So if I wasn't, I could choose another field here. I could choose sent and set it to a specific value if I needed to. But again, the default is good enough for me. You'll notice that it is smart enough to bring in the pick list values automatically there for me on a pick list field like this one is. But again, I don't need that, so I'm going to get rid of it, and I'm going to say done. Now, jumping back to our decision, this is where those two outcomes come into play. So if I drag my connector to the create record, it's going to give me the option of which path here am I going to go down. In this case, I'm going to go down the found campaign. And you'll notice that now it has created that, and it clearly defines this is the path where we found the campaign. Now, if this was a ScreenFlow or something else, I would likely be drawing another arrow out of this decision that would be the, what do I do if I didn't find the campaign path? So I've got my happy path, and then I've got the ability to create my unhappy path. In this case, we don't need to do anything. It can actually just let the flow stop. So I'm not going to create an unhappy path in this particular case. Okay, so now I've got my campaign member created. So I'm partway through my use case. The next thing that I need to do is the next part of our use case was we wanted to send an email out to that lead to validate that, yes, they do want to be a part of the campaign. And I did not create a variable to hold that email address for the lead. So I need to go out and get that information. This is where my flow starts to get a little bit gray, because I'd probably have passed in that email address instead of going out and doing a get here. But for the sake of us learning, this is actually kind of a nice way to show you a few different options. So we're going to do get lead. And our object here is the lead object. And I know the ID of my lead, so let me type in the field here for the ID equals my lead ID that I passed in. Okay, so this is my query, my where clause. Now, what I want to do is show you a few of these other options. So we let Salesforce manage it all on the first get statement that we did. In this particular one, I want to choose my fields and assign the variables myself. I want to take control of what happens here. And you'll notice when I choose this, I've got a variety of different things that show up now below. And I can choose to store all of the field values in a single record variable. So that basically just means that that all of my fields that are a part of the lead, I can store those in essence in a lead object record, or we would call it a S object. It's just a record that has all of the field values. I don't need all of those field values. So in this particular example, I'm going to use in separate variables. And what this allows me to do is take individual fields from that lead and put those into a variable that I can then reference. So let's see how we're going to do this. So the field that I care about is the email address. All right, so here's our email address. And so what I need to do is define a resource that will hold the value of that email. And so I'm going to select a new resource. And the resource has to have a type. So I'm going to have this be a type variable. And I'm going to label that lead email address. Okay, and then the data type of what it's holding is just going to be a text field. It's not a collection, so it's just a single value. And I don't need to have this available for importing or exporting. So we're going to leave those blank. I'm going to go ahead and say done, and you'll notice it takes me back to my get records. This email, the value in the email field is now going to be stored in this lead email address variable. If it does not have a value, I want that value to be stored as a null. What that's going to do for me is it it makes sure that my variable gets defined with at least something. And I'd rather have it defined with a null value that I can then reference. And null just means empty, basically. It basically means that there's nothing there, versus having to have something that I don't know what to expect. So I'm going to use this when no records are returned, set this to a null value. And we'll go ahead and say we're done. And because I did a get record, I want to check to see, did I find anything? And so I'm going to go ahead and bring another decision in. This decision is going to indicate whether or not I have an email address. So I'm just going to call it has an email address. My unhappy path is just going to be simply missing email. And I'm going to look at that new variable that I created in that get statement, which was that var email, lead email address field. And I'm going to say if that field is null, is true, then I want it to go down the missing email path. If it's not true, which is going to be my default and hopefully my happy path, we're going to call this has email. Let me get some of these connectors added here. So we're going to go from our create campaign to our get lead record, from get lead to check to see if it indeed had an email address. And then the last piece that I need to do is actually send out the email. And that email send is actually hiding underneath this action. And so I'm going to drag an action out here. And you'll see when you go into the search that there's a variety of different actions. These are actions just like what you're used to in Lightning. So if you've got the ability to create an account, that's going to show up here as an option. You can see there's add members. There's a variety of these that are already pre-built. There's log in a call, create an event, new contact. All of those types of things are actions that you're used to. The one that we're going to work with is this send email action. And so we're going to select that. And again, we're going to give it a label because everything has to have a label. And what we have now at the bottom of this page is really just defining what do we want that email to look like. And so we have a body, we have a subject, and we have email addresses that we need to tie into this thing. So let's start with the body. And we're going to use a new resource here. And that resource is, we're going to use a text template. So I'm going to select a new, and we're going to go, not use a variable this time. We're going to go all the way down here to text templates. And we're going to give it a name. We're just going to call it the email body. And this is the content of what I want that email to look like. So you can see that it is a rich text editor. So I've got the ability to italicize certain portions of the text. I can underline. You've got your bold, you've got bullets, all of the things you're used to with a rich text editor. And so this is going to be the body of our email. You can also insert other resources here. So if you wanted to insert that lead's name into this, so you could say dear Betty or whatever, whoever the lead is, you can bring those fields in and make this a nice mail merge type template here as well. So we're going to keep ours really simple. We'll say done. You can see that it brought that resource in automatically for me, so I don't have to go find it. And then our subject line, we're going to use simply monthly newsletter. So all I'm going to do is type that in. And then the last piece that I need to do is associate the email address to this record. Now, if I had a collection, and remember a collection is just multiple records, then I could use this first email address that's a collection. And if I was going to use that, I would simply just toggle that on, and it would let me go find that collection of email addresses. In this case, we only have one, and so I'm going to toggle on the other option for email addresses and simply add that variable that we created to store the email address. And we'll say we are done. We're going to drag over our element. This is going down the happy path of having an email, and we'll say that we are done. And so with that, now we've created our flow. It meets the requirements of what was requested of us. And so I need to save this before I forget. And I'm going to just simply call it, we'll call it send or create campaign member. All right, so that's going to save up here. And now you'll notice I've got the ability to activate this flow. Now, if I activate it and then I find that I've got something wrong with the flow, I'm going to then have to create a new version of this flow. And I don't want to create a new version yet. I want to test this thing before I activate it. So I can do the run. Now, run, because I've got two input variables, isn't going to really do anything for me because it's going to just simply come up and say, yeah, okay, I ran, but it honestly, it failed because it would have come here to this decision and it would have dropped out because it didn't find a campaign. Didn't find a campaign because I didn't tell it what campaign name to use. So I'm going to use the debug here instead. And debug is really nice because it's going to allow me to type in the actual input values that I've got created. And so if I come back over here to a lead record, let's use Betty this time, and I can type in or copy her lead ID, and I can put that in over here. And then if I go to my campaign, and I'm going to copy that name because I'm certain I won't type it right. I'll copy that and paste that in. This is going to now populate those variables, and I can run it. And you can see that it really doesn't show me a whole lot here. It's done. It did what it was supposed to do. But on the detail here, I've got the ability to actually walk through all of the elements of that flow, and I can see the values that came in. So it started with this lead ID variable. It set it to this value. There's my campaign name. Here's that get campaign. That's the first element that we did. And you can see that it successfully found a record. Our decision here went down the default outcome, which was it found the campaign. Here's the actual campaign record that it found, and that's the variable that we're looking for. Here's our create record for the campaign member. And this is really helpful because it actually shows me here the actual values that it wrote. So when I'm writing to that campaign, the campaign ID field here equals this value, and the lead ID equals this particular value. So the detail is really, really nice when you're trying to troubleshoot a record, or your flow, not your record, a flow, because it does give you all of the information step by step all the way through your flow. So if I come back now, one thing that's important to understand when you're debugging a flow is that it is actually running. It is not like when you are coding something, if for the developers that may be on the call, when we're coding and creating test classes, those test classes don't really do anything. It simulates what it's supposed to do. A flow does not simulate anything. It actually runs. So if I go back to this lead record, Betty, if things worked right, and it did, you can see that it actually added her to that campaign. So it is affecting real information. So keep that in mind. If for some reason you're breaking the best practices and doing this in production, just remember you are impacting potentially live data. Okay, so that is my flow. And so I'm going to go ahead and I've got another one already pre-built that I'm going to use instead of this one. So I'm going to go ahead and back out of this, but you would next activate that flow. And to kick this one off, we're going to go to Process Builder. And in Process Builder, I have a process here specifically for my lead automations. So my lead object is in my Process Builder. And my decision here is saying if my lead source has a pick list value of Flow Webinar and they have an email address. Now this is where technically I could remove this particular requirement because I've got it covered within my flow. This is probably the smarter place to put it, but just know that this is an example. So this is my criteria for when I want to run the flow. And then I've got an immediate action that happens that actually runs the flow. So let me show you here. We've got our variables that are coming from the flow, which is the lead ID. And I'm setting that to the actual record, the lead ID record that initiated this process. And then my campaign name, I've got stored here that I'm passing in. When you're creating a flow action, the action type here is simply flows. This is the one that created that. And in the auto launch flow section here where you're picking the actual flow, it's going to list for you any of the flows that are active within your org. It does have to be active. If it's not active, it will not show up in this list. And so when I choose that flow, I then can add in or populate the variables that we made available for input. Remember, the very first two things that we created on our flow was two input variables. And so if I click add row here, you can see here's those two variables. And so I simply select them and then I can assign a value to them. And that's what you see in the example here that I already have pre-built. And so if I activate our flow, our process builder, and we'll go back to setup. I do want you to see that I have the other flow already activated. So here's the flow that I pre-built and it is active. So let's go to another lead and let's just see if this works out okay. So we're going to choose Brenda this time. And Brenda does not have a lead source, so I'm going to go ahead and select that to Flow Webinar. You can see that I've got myself in here as the email address and I'm going to hit save. And if all goes well, I will receive an email here. And it sounds like I did. And I've got a few issues with my template I see. It did a little bit of HTML stuff in there that I need to clean up. But there is the actual email then that got sent. And then I'm able to, in essence, prove that my workflow worked as I intended it to. So with that, Carla, I don't know if you had questions come up in the text or the chat as we went through that. If not, I'm going to go ahead and say, if you want to unmute yourself and ask questions, we've got some time to answer those questions. So if you are one of those brave people, go ahead and unmute yourself if you've got a specific question, and we'll see if we can answer it for you.
It doesn't look like we had any
Oh,
questions in the chat, so hopefully some people do have some.
so either that means I went way over everybody's head and then we lost them, or we explained it reasonably well. So any questions that you might have? Any comments, since this is the very first time we've done a training like this, anything that would be helpful that might make these work more effectively for you? Okay,
So Terry, I was just going to tell you real quickly, thank you for being consistent with your prefixes on your label names. I appreciate that. I recommend everyone do that. It makes life a lot easier. A second thing is I do have a quick question, and this won't be necessarily for all orgs, but we use Snowflake. And do you know if Snowflake is one of those items that you have to worry about for when records are updated, that are external records?
That is not in your environment. Since I know it a little bit, it is not an external object in your org, so you're fine.
Okay, great, thank you.
And we do have a question in the chat. Am I able to get an auto launch flow on a quick action? So that is a really nice question. And Carla, you may have to help me out with this one if you have a quick answer. I'm trying to, answer.
I've definitely used a screen flow in a quick action.
Yes.
But I don't know about an auto launch flow, so I'm not sure.
I'm not certain of that either.
I don't know if you could.
I don't know.
I guess it would be kind of cool if you could.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of defeats a little bit of the purpose of what an auto launch is, because an auto launch is something that you want it to kind of trigger.
Oh, right.
Behind the scenes. So let's just see if I can create one. And that would be a flow. Yeah, it's not listed here. These flows here are all the screen flows that are showing up. So it looks like the answer is probably no on that one.
That would make sense.
Yeah. Lisa, I hear you're having some, I see that you're having some audio challenges. Any tips for what to think about when you first start a flow, as far as what elements and resources to start with? Yeah. Carla, do you have any thoughts you want to add to that one?
I think any IDs that you will need in your flow, I would say you can go ahead and just create those variables from the get-go, but the flow makes it really easy to create those resources when you're in it. Like Terry made the, I think the campaign, I can't remember which one you did, or the email address right inside of the get records or anything like that. You could just create while you're inside an element. So the resources, I think the IDs are usually the main ones I start with, but then I kind of create them as I go, as I need them.
Yeah, I do too. And the ones that I will always start with are the ones that I know that I need to push into the flow from outside. If I've got variables like that I need, then I will always create those at the front.
Yep.
Good question. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have another one in the chat. It says, will you explain if we can call a flow from Apex instead of Process Builder?
Yes, you can. So Apex does allow you to call flows. And I would have to go out and find that, but the answer is absolutely yes.
I haven't had an example where I've done that. If I'm already in Apex doing something, I'll just code it myself, but I do call Apex from Flow and Process Builder as well. If I need to expand the capabilities of Flow and I need to actually call a class to do some extra logic, I will do that too. Yeah.
You want to be careful. So, Flow, you don't have extreme control over what's going on there. And so you do have to be really careful with with the order of execution and things that you're doing within the flow. Remember one of the best practices that it said was to always create your records toward the end of the flow. Well, in this particular flow, I had to create the record in order to get them to the campaign. So technically I could have broken this flow into a subflow and done the actual sending the email in a different flow. And then this would have been the actual end of the process. But so in code, you definitely have a lot more control and you can build things out more efficiently there. All right, good questions. So I've got just one last reminder that I want to promote again is our May 12th user group that we have with Chick. Again, if you have not signed up for that one, I strongly encourage you. That's a do not miss session. So please get that one on your calendars. Chick is just a tremendous leader and speaker. You will be entertained with him, and he's going to help you learn how to build your personal brand. And that's important to us because our brand is in essence credibility. So as we are as admins are trying to promote our ideas and we're salespeople in essence. We're selling ideas and trying to get people to buy into certain things. Chick is just a fantastic speaker. So if you've not signed up for that May 12th user group, please get that on your calendar sooner than later. So with that.
Hey, Terry.
Yeah.
I know we only have like a minute left. We had another question come in.
Yeah.
I answered it in the text, but I just wanted to
okay, good.
Bring that to light too.
Go ahead and take the lead on that if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, the question was, will it be possible to add a screen so the user can choose which campaign to add the lead or contact to? And my response was, you can do that, but not with an auto launch flow. You'd want to create a screen flow, maybe from an action that they could look up the campaign and add it to it from there. So it would be a screen flow that you would launch from an action would be my recommendation.
Yep. And we will be doing something with screen flows on the June 16th one. So you will see screens at that point. Yeah, very good.
Cool.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining. If you have feedback or thoughts, please shoot those our direction so that we can make these as efficient as possible. Thanks again for joining. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Terry.